In the midst of the Great Depression, a time best remembered for endless breadlines and relentless despair, there existed a curious, almost paradoxical realm, the world of the ultra-wealthy. Picture it. While the masses found creative uses for cardboard in both attire and housing, a select few were debating the merits of caviar versus foie gras for Wednesday brunch. Our story drifts into the lives of such individuals, where opulence was as common as a good yawn on a cloudy day. Imagine a palatial estate with sprawling gardens guarded by meticulously manicured shrubs, as if each leaf had been combed through by someone with an unhealthy fixation on symmetry. Amidst the ornate halls of these estates, there lay a secret lifestyle. Wealthy individuals like the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Rockefellers found themselves insulated from the woes of the outside world, living in an opalescent bubble of indulgence. They passed the days with hobbies surprisingly akin to an endurance sport of luxury. Imagine a game of polo with Irish wolfhounds as spectators and the occasional llama wandering onto the field, tricking a player or two into mistaking them for obstacles. Dinner parties served as nightly reconvening of the exquisite society, with European chefs flown in to demonstrate that there was indeed a way to make even the humble potato glamorous, often disguising it as a pomme de terre à la somnolence, which in translation means a potato asleep in its own splendor, nestled beneath a blanket of cream and spices. In one particularly grand family, the Crawfields, descendants of British monarch-adjacent minor royalty, and proud owners of several unnecessarily large peacocks, who had been allotted their own gardener, mind you, had a peculiar ritual. Thursdays were reserved for historical fact nights, where they indulged in a sumptuous meal while recounting historical tales, often delightfully inaccurate, if not outright fabricated. For instance, dear old Uncle Rutherford was known to retell riveting accounts of how his great-great-grandfather single-handedly saved Napoleon from a rabid squirrel attack. Napoleon, you see, was terribly allergic, Rutherford would begin, his voice oozing with self-satisfaction, while his wife casually topped off everyone's champagne with bubble precision. Beyond their own entertainment, sheltering and feeding a small army of household staff was part of everyday life for these affluent families. One worker, Madeline, had a knack for weaving escapades that would make any saga about missing socks seem extraordinary. Her tales of the mysteriously flitting cat with one blue and one green eye, said to be a reincarnated seafaring captain, provided just enough intrigue to startle a dozing butler at attention. Moreover, the wealth wasn't just in treasures too extensive to fit sonic detail. It was their time and how generously they bestowed it upon their ceaseless amusements. One could lose a Tuesday afternoon to the curious game of lawn chess, where butlers were the life-sized pieces and strategies were as complex as a fanciful dream. As the sun dipped below the horizon, these matches evolved into twilight spectacles accentuated by the wise, albeit ponderous, commentary of Lady Penelope and her penchant for analogies about life's more metaphorical traps, often setting everyone alight with laughter. An evening's close meant retreating to chambers plush with goose-down pillows designed to cradle dreams as if each slumber was a piece of exquisite art. The night often unfolded with the soft rustle of silk as flames cast gentle shadows on the intricately patterned wallpaper, lulling all to sleep in a serene cocoon of oblivion, a stark contrast to those outside palace gates, whose lullabies featured more of the troubling serenades of a searching world. And so we find ourselves at the cusp of yet another tale. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. Would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. In our next gentle recount, whenever you choose to join us again, we'll uncover more about these families, as enveloped in luxury as they were, discovering how their lives wove into the fabric of a world much bigger, if not much kinder. As we drift deeper into the plush velvet nights of the 1930s, let us paint a picture of a world both familiar and fantastically foreign. While dust storms swirled across the prairies and breadlines snaked through city streets, a curious subculture of society thrived in a manner so opulent that it would put a fairy tale kingdom to shame. Picture, if you will, the task of choosing the right shade of caviar to match your evening robe. Yes, this was a real conundrum among the upper crust. Our stage is a sumptuous Manhattan ballroom in the year 1932, where soft jazz whispers its nocturne through a sea of silk and satin. Imagine for a moment the life of a well-heeled gentleman. Let's call him Reginald, because that feels appropriately distinguished. Reginald, the owner of this particular ballroom, is a connoisseur of rare experiences. He delighted in hosting extravagant soirees, not because his heart brimmed with hospitality, but because, frankly, what else was there to do when one was relentlessly wealthier than most small nations? These events were adorned with ice sculptures that were, ironically, shaped like flames, a cheeky gesture poke at the very idea of excess. Sculptors were flown in from the finest icy reaches of the Arctic, or at least so the guests were led to believe over glasses of champagne fizzy enough to tickle even the most subdued of noses. The ultra-wealthy employed an intriguing team of people hardly recognizable today. For instance, let us not forget the perennial button pusher, an individual tasked with operating every conceivable button one might encounter throughout a mansion, elevators, phonographs, and even, believe it or not, dinner gongs. It was said that the very best button pushers could operate a dozen devices in tandem without so much as a stray nod backward to avoid knocking over the Dom Perignon or their own polished dignity. But what about the Great Depression, you ask? Indeed, the economy had crumbled like a cookie in a toddler's fist. Yet within these gilded walls, the outside world was reframed from grayscale into pastel. For the upper echelon, currency itself was almost immaterial, a mere detail attended to by accountants in bowler hats and trembling hands, whispering through spreadsheets as if these were secrets rather than numbers. Meanwhile, dinners were served with a flourish that suggested food emerged not from a kitchen, but from the heavens themselves. Cuisine was as stratified as society, with golden desserts precisely engineered to evoke the architectural majesty of ancient pyramids. Such indulgence was often marred only by the inconvenience of discovering a lone golden flake had found its way onto one's attire, no doubt dislodged by overzealous dining. And let us not overlook the inner sanctum of these grand houses, the libraries. Rooms so vast that books were an academic footnote, overshadowed by ornately framed mirrors reflecting chandeliers that sparkled like upside-down garden parties of luminescent fairies. These shelves carried tomes bound in leather, their spines uncracked, yet lovingly dusted by dedicated bibliophiles for appearance's sake. Anyone of severe scholarly disposition would perhaps appear like a tourist in these corridors of curated knowledge. In the plush comfort of his expansive library, our dear fictional friend Reginald might have contemplated the times. He would perch in a chair designed to encourage profound thoughts, or at least discourage nodding off, pondering whether he ought to invest in a monocle for serious considerations about the state of the world. Then again, the prospect of monocles, despite their implied sophistication, always seemed to venture too close to impracticality. After all, who could take any decisions seriously while tethered to eyewear that sounded suspiciously like a half-hearted carnival toy? Alas, as the night waned, Reginald would bid adieu to his array of extravagant guests, each stepping lightly down marble staircases, retiring to their respective palatial abodes. They climbed into grand beds with carvings so ornate that even the dreams of an artist would seem understated by comparison. And so, dear listener, as you gently glide toward your own dreams, consider the secret lives of those who, perched high above the mists of everyday strife, found their own peculiar comfort in the gilded distractions of their day. In the web of time, next we find ourselves journeying even further into this glittering labyrinth, as golden sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, the home of one Cornelia. Vanderbilt stood as an imposing chandelier left by an over-enthusiastic hoarder at a particularly extravagant garage sale. The Biltmore estate, an expanse that made Buckingham Palace look like a quaint cottage, was a striking emblem of opulence, glitz, and more velvet drapes than anyone could reasonably require. The time was the 1930s, where the Great Depression gripped much of the globe in a waltz of worry and want, but within Biltmore's 3-acre dining room, the size of which could simultaneously host dinner, badminton, and occasionally a celebratory elephant, the rhythms of scarcity played an entirely different tune. For amidst hard times, the ultra-wealthy lived in a world uniquely their own, each day a tapestry of indulgent delights and occasionally bewildering choices. Cornelia, though ever so much an icon of the affluent society, found that her greatest challenge was not economic turmoil, but the plight of what to wear on formal Tuesdays versus relaxed Fridays. As she contemplated her wardrobe of sequined robes that could double as wedding tents, her attention was interrupted by her personal butler, Reginald, a man whose grave demeanor suggested he was deeply allergic to levity. "My lady, might I suggest the champagne-embroidered gown for this evening?" Reginald proposed, his voice serene as a lullaby for insomniac clouds. Cornelia sighed, for she knew that Reginald's recommendations were not simply fashion tips, but subtle attempts to outdo the neighboring Astors in their daily sartorial sparring. It was a competition held without words, but with the silent judgment of pearls, lapels, and hats, one could comfortably live inside for a winter. The day continued with Cornelia embarking on a routine distinctly her own. While many of her less affluent contemporaries might focus on canny soup-based strategies, she found herself navigating the aristocratic sport of croquet between horse stables, accompanied by the sulkingly polite presence of her poodle, Papillon, who wore a tiny hat that whispered of authority, particular to an obedient sovereign. When evening descended with a gentle flourish, Cornelia hosted a dinner where pastries defied both gravity and waistlines. Here, foie gras was a necessary accessory, alongside witty banter that hovered effortlessly over piccata and pearlescent tableware. It was a time where silence was golden, but gossip was platinum, mostly concerning the shocking discovery of Mr. Harrington's excessive appreciation for bathtub gin, a scandal only because he preferred it slightly stir-crazy, with a slice of orange. Her guests, a glittering cadre of upper crust and, quite possibly, upper sourdough, debated the pressing issues. Should yachts be made bigger, and did grapefruit properly belong in fruit salad? Sir Tiddlybalm, whose monocle was rumoured to have its own postal address, gestured grandly with a celery stick, hypothesizing its potential as a rudimentary tennis racket under the right circumstances. In the quiet twilight hours, as silver trays vanished as gracefully as polite disinterest, Cornelia retreated with a novel in hand. It was an experimental read, daringly titled Zipper's Fashion Friend or Foe, a book so riveting that upon its completion, many found themselves in the same state of incompletion they had begun with. Cornelia Vanderbilt's world was a curious construct, where luxury and humor danced a quiet ballet along corridors echoing with laughter, and perhaps distant echoes of prosperity's past. It was an existence so fantastically insulated that even the Great Depression seemed naught but a distant line of somber grey on an otherwise vibrant canvas of excess. And as the evening drew to a gentle close, the stars blinked serenely down on the Biltmore estate, unfazed by time or tonality. In this cloistered cocoon of indulgence, the world outside might seem surreal, but Cornelia's reveries were just significant enough to tickle the tender threads of sleep. Her eyes slowly closed, dreams painting technicolor visions of tomorrow's hilariously daunting question. Should the rose garden be expanded, or would the garden gnomes protest a red carpet intrusion? With this quaint and calm reflection, we drift onwards to the airy world of slumber and secrets. Nestled within the opulence of the ultra-wealthy, during the Great Depression, it becomes clear that their reality was somewhat removed from the breadlines and Dust Bowl stories we typically associate with the 1930s. It's as if the Great Depression knocked on their gleaming mahogany doors, only to be politely informed by a white-gloved butler that they were otherwise engaged. Yes, their lives spun a tale less of hardship and more of strategic adaptation, akin to a well-rehearsed game of charades where the answer was always prosperity. Picture, if you will, a Manhattan penthouse belonging to one such affluent family. From the outside, it seems a fortress of comfort, towering above the initial clamour of commoners' woes below. Stepping inside, it's a different world entirely, a lavish cocoon of silk drapery and softly murmuring staff. Mrs. Winthrop, the matron of this particular abode, engaged in an economy of luxury that would make even the most budget-conscious housewife raise an eyebrow. This was, after all, an age where conspicuous consumption was out and strategic subtlety was in. Mrs. Winthrop's sweater sets were cashmere naturally, but they were adorned with costume jewelry instead of their more bejeweled counterparts, a silent nod to the pervasive social pressures to appear empathetic. The pearls may have been faux, but they were strung with the utmost sincerity. It was all about the illusion of sacrifice, pretending to water down the champagne to show solidarity with those sipping tap. However, the theatre of thrift extended beyond mere accessorizing. For instance, the ultra-wealthy had peculiar methods of showing their fellow feeling, perhaps best, exemplified by their approach to dining. In these grand households, elaborate dinners were orchestrated with a rather amusing level of denial. Caviar was served, naturally not in heaping scoops. It was dotted delicately, implying they too faced rationing, though their ration was more beluga than beans. Imagine them perhaps winking at each other over their crystal glasses, playfully echoing the script of the day. We're all in this together. Speaking of meals, it remained entirely unfashionable to flaunt excess, even if you could still afford it. Thus, frugality became all the rage. Resourceful chefs, the unsung alchemists of the time, were tasked with repurposing leftovers into glorious masterpieces. That turkey from last night's banquet might reappear, masquerading as a sophisticated new entree tonight, topped with innovations such as depression sauce, which translated to whatever's left in the pantry. These high society types didn't let the market's crash dampen their spirits, or their spirits cabinet for that matter. Social gatherings took on a different edge, intellectual rather than ostentatious. Think salons rather than soirees, where guests shared pointed political witticisms alongside canapés. Discussions of Keynesian economics mingled with the evening's gossip, and laughter echoed alongside the clinking of cocktail glasses, a charming soundtrack to complement the jitterbugging shadows on the walls. But perhaps the most striking illustration of opulent ingenuity came through their travel habits. While the rest of the world might shy away from indulgence, the jet set off to European destinations, albeit now referring to these jaunts with the rather democratic term, study tours. Educational enlightenment was a clever guise for enjoying the French Riviera's balmy breezes or marveling at Italian art, and certainly made any extravagant expense report sound entirely justifiable, as if Camembert was a critical educational resource. And so, as we glance again at the grandeur of those time-worn penthouses, it seems the Great Depression wasn't so much about tightening belts here, as it was about cinching couture waistlines, done subtly, without losing the posh sophistication. Despite the world's dire straits, the opulent class maintained a steady hand on the tiller of their luxury yachts, navigating the storm with style, grace, and perhaps a splash of playful irony. As someone extinguishes the last flickering candle in this grand scene, we prepare to dawdle further into this reel of delicate resilience, entering another vignette of this fanciful era, where velvet-gloved thrift whispers its secret charms under the cloak of night. In the midst of the Great Depression, as the world tilted precariously on the edge of economic calamity, the ultra-wealthy found themselves navigating a strange dual existence, one foot in fantasy, the other in financial ruin. As we gently float into the eccentric world of opulence, amidst despair, let's visit the grand ballroom of a particularly peculiar palace, where Edward, Fortune, favors the bald Morris through one of his signature soirees. Picture the scene, a ballroom soaked in the warm glow of 1,000 crystal chandeliers, each piece polished to the point of reflecting a dreamy constellation right back at the guests. The room is filled not with the despair driving most of the world, but rather the usual suspects of old money eccentricity. Men whose monocles glinted like suspicious hawks, and women whose pearls threatened to weigh them earthward. In this lavish atmosphere, Edward was notorious for his unusual skills, such as balancing his cocktail glass perfectly atop his own shiny, hairless head. Guests would cheerfully compete in grand tournaments to best his feat, often with rather sticky and sloshy outcomes. Ah, what a spectacle it was to see. Perfectly good wine cascading off extraordinarily expensive suits, like waterfalls of sheer first-world ridiculousness. But the party wasn't just about this elegant chaos. Edward had a penchant for live entertainment that mirrored the extravagance of his gatherings. He adored planting unexpected surprises among his guests. Once, Edward hired a circus troupe and tucked them away in various corners of his ballroom, with acrobats who stealthily twirled from chandeliers and performers who shuffled as if hiding amidst the more statuesque partygoers. His pride, however, lay in the jazz band he'd borrowed straight from New Orleans, an ensemble capable of lulling guests to near-hypnotic sleep or startling them awake with a riotous rendition of the latest escapades. Yet, the charm of the evening didn't end there. The estate grounds offered a vision that few could resist. As twilight befell the garden, a pathway of lanterns would guide Edward's guests to a massive hedge maze designed to confound the most astute of dukes. It was in this verdant labyrinth that truly daring types could saunter among rustling leaves in search of the hidden speakeasy, where one could find the finest prohibition-evading concoctions this side of the Mississippi. As guests meandered from ballroom to garden, Edward, ever the cunning host, would often surprise them with transforming his billiard room into a makeshift cinema. There, he'd arrange flickerings of New Age black and white marvels, the likes of which most folks would spend an entire week's wages just to glimpse at the local theatre, all set against a backdrop soundscape achieved by employing an entire flock of classically trained parrots, each clad in tuxedos naturally. Was it opulent? Oh, certainly. Absurd? Unquestionably. But in a world where the majority worried over their next meals, or possibly eviction for Edward and his invitees, it was an alternate universe built entirely on whimsy and the endless cushion of their fortunes. It was as though time stopped. Elsewhere, men and women were queuing for bread, yet here, they congregated for delicacies, and time was marked not by clocks, but by the persistent clinking of crystal on crystal. These parties served not just as entertainment, but as reminders for the guests of their isolation from the fatigue of the outside world. Alas, even within these isle-like gatherings, whispers flowed as liberally as champagne. How long could they maintain this opulent oasis against the tide of a waning economy? As midnight drew close and the ghostly glow of dawn peeked over the horizon, the rich and delighted would meander towards their quarters, where even sleep promised a luxurious adventure in dreamland. Draping the silky covers over the truths they'd ignore for another evening, they'd await the next gathering, believing, perhaps insanely, that their plush festivities could keep gloom at bay indefinitely. And now, as we edge towards the gentle arms of slumber, let's float softly onward, woven into the tapestry of tales woven by the glamour and grandeur of the horse-gallant fixtures of those fateful years. Once upon a time, in the depths of the Great Depression, while most of the world pinched pennies and fashioned new toys from old socks, the ultra-wealthy continued to sail their gilded yachts through the turbulent seas of economic despair. Picture them, if you will, sipping champagne as they purportedly struggled to decide between foie gras and caviar for lunch. Our tale this evening invites you into a cozy, secret world where the financial titans and their ilk lived in sprawling mansions so vast that you could practically get lost on the way to the breakfast room. This, of course, was only a problem when breakfast was particularly exciting or the bacon was served startlingly crisp. The rest of the world might have been having baked beans, but the ultra-rich were still hosting miniature Renaissance fairs on their back lawns. After all, even a Wall Street crash could hardly dampen their spirits. Not when jousting and a 5-course meal were scheduled for later in the day. While soup kitchens became the gathering place for the many, the billionaires of the time exchanged spirited debate over the latest Art Deco furnishings and whether they clashed with their manners' neo-Gothic architecture. It really was a never-ending design dilemma, like choosing between sequins and lace for a particularly decadent ball gown. However, it wasn't all excess and extravagance. This era did inspire a new, albeit involuntary, innovation among the wealthy, economizing the human way. For instance, extravagant dinners mysteriously included at least 2 new chefs straight from Paris. As to why new staff was continually necessary, let's just say that certain patrician tempers and culinary expectations occasionally diverged like the proverbial fork in the road, though not the kind of fork gracing their plentiful number of dining tables. Evenings in these shimmering manors offered entertainment options without compare. While radio might have been the height of technology for the masses, the privileged opted for live orchestras or jazz bands because naturally, why listen to recorded music when you have a ballroom that echoes sound like a cathedral? And if the band struck the right chord, perhaps an impromptu Charleston or waltz would ensue. A dizzying escape from reality, punctuated only by the occasional clumsy dancer attempting a spirited lift. But for one particular gent, who we'll call Mr. DeGilded, imagine him a sort of mysterious Gatsby figure. The evenings could have taken an unexpectedly somber turn if it weren't for his dactylic escapades. See, in the candle-lit glow of his parlor, he vastly preferred his own poetry readings, alternating, of course, with his collection of rare exotic parrots whom he claimed experienced poetic enlightenment. These colorful critiques mostly consisted of spirited squawks and the occasional flurry of feathers. Despite the apparent ease with which they carried on, in opulent radiance, there lay an undeniable and mythically charged fear amongst them, being dragged, perhaps metaphorically, into the harsh, clamorous embrace of regular society. What an inconvenient tragedy it would be to exchange their plush silk robes for sensible woolen wear, or to face the grueling line at a soup kitchen's ladle-wielding station. A fate such as this fueled even the sleepiest prattle over sherry and cigars, lending their evenings an undercurrent of both exhilaration and mild trepidation. And so, as the fire crackles merrily on, casting dancing shadows upon their opulent world, we might appreciate the duality of their existence. Caught between indulgence and a creeping sense of change, they represent not just the resilience of wealth, but the quirks and peculiarities that invariably accompany it. In that soft, dream-weaved cocoon, we leave tonight's chapter as they dreamily muse over tomorrow's trivial pursuits. Let your eyelids now find comfort in the gentle embrace of sleep, and as your dreams unfold, perhaps you'll wander among elaborate gardens or traverse the hallowed halls of mansions where whispers of laughter still linger in the air. With a gentle sigh, we drift forward into the enveloping night, readying ourselves for yet another chapter of discovery in this cozy tapestry of what it meant to richly live during a time of want. Picture a lavish, balloon-filled ballroom glimmering with crystal chandeliers. Now make a mental note that you're in the middle of the Great Depression. Yes, wealth in those days was not merely about securing your next meal or scrounging up enough coins for a new pair of boots, but about hosting high society soirees where the punch was flowing, and everyone pretended the stock market crash had merely been a rumor whispered by mischievous foxes in the night. Our journey takes us now to one such soiree, organized by the dear ever-optimistic Mrs. Edith Merriweather, an old money socialite whose disdain for the word recession was only rivaled by her extensive collection of imported French perfumes. Mrs. Merriweather was known for her unyielding belief that her impressive gatherings could, quite literally, brighten up any dull economy simply through the force of her charisma and sheer number of gardenias on display. It was a typical Thursday evening, and Mrs. Merriweather was preparing for one of her enchanting salons, where Beethoven waltzed with Bach, and the wine cellar was encouraged to stretch its legs. Tonight's theme was an evening in Byzantium, though most guests would swear the only thing truly Byzantine was unraveling the mystery of how on earth anyone could actually afford the golden-threaded tablecloths. Upon entering the spacious parlors of the Merriweather estate, guests were greeted not just by elegant attires designed to outshine the heavens, but also by the enthusiastic barks of Clancy, the supposed purebred corgi, whom rumors suggested had been bought at a flea market for the price of a mostly drunk Coca-Cola. But back to the celebrations where the art of the conversation sparkled as brightly as the sequins sewn into Mrs. Merriweather's gown. There was Mr. Thaddeus Pumpernickel, a stalwart of the community, whose tales of Wall Street triumphs ran parallel to the same 3 stories he often repeated after his 3rd glass of sherry. Though Pumpernickel was never actually seen without a monocle, its functionality was often questioned. He claimed it was a scion to his character, much like his affinity for lopsided top hats. Guests danced, or in some cases, rhythmically swayed in a manner that suggested a not inconsiderable amount of confusion between a tango and a foxtrot. For a brief moment, everyone seemed to forget the outside world, a universe overcome by economic despair. Instead, they were swept up in a cocoon of vibrant melodies, tales of whimsical travels, and one very enthusiastic round of charades that would go down in history as the evening a butler nailed the mime representation of inflation with such gusto that, well, a portrait fell off the wall. As the night meandered like a gentle brook into the early hours, guests took turns boasting mysterious connections to European aristocracy, an uncle twice removed who claimed a duchy the size of a postage stamp, or a cousin exaggerated into Spanish royalty through an elaborate series of marriages that spanned several generational leaps and an indeterminate number of inherited titles. With a touch of a fairy tale about them, these gatherings painted a serene picture amid the pervading gloom, much like a candle's gentle flicker against an imposing midnight. Each twirl, each enchanting laugh, reminded these lucky few that wealth during this turbulence was not simply about escaping reality, but serving as an orchestra conductor, directing harmony within a world longing for a steady beat. Eventually, the music quieted, leaving only the soft whispers of the chandeliers, serenading those who lingered like sleepy autumn leaves, refusing to give in to the call of slumber. So, as the night drew to a close, and the last vestiges of the evening's magic settled in, Mrs. Merriweather sighed contentedly. She watched the butler retrieve the fallen portrait with a knowing smile, and realized there was something timeless in these elegant distractions, a melody that played through both opulent balls and the humble notes of everyday endurance. As the guests departed, and the halls at last hushed their gentle echo, Mrs. Merriweather contemplated the dawn of another day with its unpredictable fortunes yet to unfold. Suspended in her world of luxurious enchantments, she bade farewell to her evening compatriots, all among the sleeping stars. And quietly, another chapter gently turned, leading us onward to deeper secrets whispered within the embrace of the ever-unfolding past. In the midst of the Great Depression, while most people were scraping by on breadlines and at soup kitchens, a select few in America were living their own kind of Gatsby moments, albeit in a slightly understated manner. Picture this: a world where lobsters were still being chauffeured around the dining table, even if they had to dodge the occasional dust bunny that dared to invade their territory. For these ultra-wealthy, the era was less about despair and more about finding creative ways to remain blissfully opulent while adopting a sprinkling of practical frugality. Sure, the headlines screamed economic doom, but inside those grand palatial homes, life was about keeping up appearances, even when the silver had to take an occasional spa day for some unexpected tarnish therapy. The luxury automobiles still purred gently down private roads like purring pastel panthers, and their owners maintained a variety of domestic staff, albeit with job titles that now served dual purposes. The butler, having received a laudable crash course in economic survival, could also recite poetry and perform minor plumbing repairs. It was efficiency at its finest. Why have someone else fix the leaky kitchen faucet when Jeeves had already perfected the iambic pentameter? Dining habits, too, adapted in curious ways. Lavish feasts of beef. Wellington had slightly reduced portions, and caviar was generously mixed with the nostalgia of the good old pre-depression days. Champagne flowed less freely, yet the household's resident harpist was always available for an impromptu evening sonata to amplify the ambience with a sense of prosperity. After all, nothing else shrieks prosperity louder than a harp and sparkling water masquerading in last night's bubbly flute. Social gatherings persisted, albeit they took on an air of dignified casualness. Instead of the flamboyant galas of the Roaring Twenties, Receptions were more laid-back affairs, a testament to how one could sip their tea pinky up, but with a nod to leisurewear rather than formal attire. Guests arrived with enthusiasm, though often veiling their queries about just how lavish those cranberry tarts really were when you accounted for creative pastry economizing. Fashion, too, danced on the line between lavish and pragmatic. The pearls might not be plucked straight from the oyster, but their synthetic cousins were undoubtedly chic. Sequins still sparkled like the stars they mimicked, and silk evening gowns just so happened to be enticingly paired with somewhat threadbare cardigans. Living in style, it seemed, equated to inventively redefining one's champagne tastes to accommodate the reality of a party punch budget. Opulence dipped its toes in practicality, with estates often turning empty patches of lavish lawn into modest vegetable gardens. Even those born into untold riches could be spotted in the privacy of their own meticulously manicured grounds, fumbling with clippers as they attempted to persuade radishes to align to their ideal dimensions. The sight was akin to an artist laboring over a masterpiece, or the moment a doting parent realizes a child's crayon scribbles are really abstract art. Yet despite the subtle underpinnings of practicality, rest assured that those fortunate souls of elite status never let the Great Depression fully disrupt their penchant for drama and comfort. Their stories, whisked with subtle sophistication, were occasionally less focused on monetary value and more on weaving a tapestry embroidered with highlights of bygone glories and future tales of conquest. As twilight painted the skies of the 1930s, dreams of affluence intermingled with reality's practicalities. Listeners nestled comfortably in bed can close their eyes. Imagine tales woven around vegetable crumpets and almost authentic pearls, dropping off to slumber amidst thoughts of how this small slice of historic fancy subtly blends with reality, grounding it in a world precious yet somehow inclusive of all its quirks. Now nestled in snugly as we move. Fourth, feel free to ponder whether narrative takes on more show or tells significance in the unfolding tapestry of this charming series. Imagine, if you will, floating down the sleepy currents of history's river towards an era draped in sepia-toned hues, the Great Depression. But wait, you gasp in astonishment as a magnificent mansion emerges from the peripheral fog of the past. Yes, dear dreamer, nestled amidst the downs of despair, some swells found themselves living in opulent opulence, where even a recession was merely a new set of challenges for that game of bridge. Picture yourself in a plush drawing room where the air tastes faintly of freshly peeled oranges, a luxury even Aladdin might have admired. Here, the ultra-wealthy recline on sofas more elaborate than an ancient scroll script, their fingers occasionally brushing the tassels like languorous cats to golden yarn. Their currency, you see, might have felt the pinch of the Depression, but their spirits were buoyed by a different kind of stock. Optimism. Quite rich. Amidst this glittering excess, where chandeliers tinkle like the laughter of playful cherubs, our glamorous guests, wearing clothes that seem stitched of moonlight and whispers, ponder a novel idea. The art of economizing. Is two chauffeurs a tad redundant when one could suffice? Perhaps that extra yacht is best lent to wiping the metaphorical tear off a neglected harbor. With profound contemplation etched across faces as they sip from cups of the finest tea, they decide economic solidarity is noble high art. Yet, my sleepy friend, the discourse, though world-changing in their minds, probably more often shifted to the trivial delights of daily life. Reports tell us of lavish indoor picnics organized to replicate Paris in spring. The fact that the real Paris might have been finding its bread slowly dwindling was an aside they didn't quite acknowledge. It's easy to emphasize joie de vivre from a balcony more grand than a castle. Souen courtyard. Within these fortress-like walls, we see libraries filled with leather-bound volumes of every shade of brown and ambiguity, in case anyone wished to enlighten themselves during this period of enforced leisure. But let's not succumb to the idea that our aristocrats weren't adapting heroically to hardship. No, as lights dimmed and fireplaces crackled, they harnessed their plucky resilience, manifesting in the form of extravagant house parties. A good night's slumber, it seemed, was forever eluded in favor of escapades under the moon's benevolent gaze. Oh, how the tunes of jazz spilled over, pirouetting into the hallways and ushering all to dance with abandon as if their very souls were fueled by the melodies themselves. In these hours, when the alabaster clock ticked his stories of time past, our high society folk would align themselves with the beat, claiming timelessness amidst their whirl. Meanwhile, the grand kitchens below operated like bustling bazaars from far-off lands, with cooks orchestrating feasts to make ancient emperors envious. Baked Alaska served on silver platters, flaming like the torch of hope every guest secretly wished upon. The greatest trick of all was that 11-course dinners still appeared miraculously, as economies shrank elsewhere. For some, inventions were born from passion, but for these, life was the most indulgent muse of necessity. So, rest comfortably now, cocooned in the absurd charm of former extravagance woven with thin threads of fantasy. While it may be hard to fathom sleeping inside such gilded cages of comfort, recall how the friction of contrasting times can foster soft lullabies for the willing ear. And quietly now, allow yourself to drift towards the coming chapter, where the dreamscape whispers yet another tale through the velvety folds of dreamtime. The night drapes on, revealing secrets as silky as the powder blue curtains that once screened the follies of the world. Amidst the era of the heat ice, Great Depression, the image many hold in their tired minds is that of somber breadlines snaking around street corners, or dusty, forlorn towns whispering echoes of better days through the wind. But while many struggled, there was a rarefied realm where the clinking of crystal glasses and gentle strains of violins carried on undisturbed. Welcome to the world of Carrie Vanderbilt Trimmingham, no relation to any Vanderbilt you may know. Despite the misnomer, she relished living up to her self-styled grandeur in defiance of the decade's prevailing financial gloom. Carrie's mornings began not with the crack of dawn, but with the warm embrace of the afternoon sun filtering through heavy brocade curtains. Shunning any invention remotely resembling an alarm clock, she relied instead on the loyalty of her butler, Jules, who gingerly delivered her breakfast of caviar and toast on a sterling silver tray, precisely upon the first tick of noon. In these circles, it was understood that one did not visit Wall Street unless one's bespoke silk pajamas, monogrammed of course, were accompanied by a fine breakfast and a lingering sense of entitlement. Some may consider this vain, but Carrie found fiscal misfortune far too dull a motif for her life's tapestry. Rising from her feather-down fortress, she'd gracefully glide towards her mirrored vanity. Her reflection reassured her of her place in the world more than any stock certificate could. Her sable robe flowed behind her like the train of a duchess as she pondered which jeweled headpiece, most aptly whispered, affected nonchalance for the Wednesday night gala. True to the spirit of the times, or lack thereof, Carrie's afternoons were dedicated to more leisurely pursuits. In a world obsessed with austerity, she found comfort in collecting what was left of the world's joy, preferably acquired at exclusive auctions where other titans of industry might outbid the recession itself for one lavish treasure or another. Rare paintings, antique jewelry, or even the occasional peculiar artifact deemed absolutely indispensable for survival were fair game. After all, one never knew when one might need an Aztec jade mask to liven up an otherwise drab cocktail party conversation. Occasionally, Carrie entertained her small circle of equally indifferent peers, for whom the woes of the nation might as well have been a faint and distant murmur, barely audible over the sound of laughter and champagne corks leaping from their bottles. At a soiree hosted by none other than her dear friend Leland J. Chesterworth III, perhaps the only person who could rival Carrie's creative indifference to historical context, they amused themselves by donning elaborate costumes of various eras. This particular evening, Carrie came dressed as Marie Antoinette, but without the requisite tragic ending, of course. Only the swathes of fabric and powdered wigs made the cut. Dinner parties at Chez Trimmingham were exercises in culinary excess. Carrie's chef, A maestro imported from Paris presented dishes not merely as meals, but as temporary housing for tiny sculptural masterpieces. The evening's highlight might be a recreation of the Colosseum, carved entirely from Gorgonzola, provoking wonder and mild existential angst from all fortunate enough to gaze upon its very cheesy splendor. For her evening entertainment, Carrie chose not the gloomy radio broadcasts that pervaded the airwaves, but rather the finest silent films. She spoke of her favorite stars as though they were old friends, each flick of Chaplin's hat or glance from Garbo, a testament to the luxury of seeing life untarnished by poverty's heavy hand. Heated debates over the merits of different shades of grey and black and white films perhaps seemed trivial in hindsight, but to display any interest in banality was simply not on Carrie's agenda. As the night wound down, Carrie found solace in correspondence, a style of communication she'd maintained with the deftness of a diplomat, composed with an artful style destined for admirers and forgetters alike. Her pen graced thick, luxurious paper with thoughts that were light as well-cooked soufflés, letters that perhaps spent more time basking in her expensive perfume than they did in the nation's postal bags. And so it went. The days unfurled like gilded invitations to soirees not of this world, while the Great Depression loomed over the horizon like a faded sunset. As she drifted towards slumber, Carrie pondered none of these details. Instead, she simply let herself be carried by the gentle tides of dreams, aboard her imaginary yacht wandering through serene, uncharted seas. And as such, laughter and opulence danced into the night. We turn now, dear listener, to explore another echoed corridor of this unique historical era, somewhere far removed yet strikingly similar in its peculiarities. In the twilight of the Great Depression, the ultra-wealthy lived in a paradox of silent splendor and discreet decadence. As the world outside grappled with breadlines and dust bowl storms, the crème de la crème congregated in spaces that sounded more like the lyrics of a jazz-age lullaby than reality. It was a time when luxury donned a cloak of conscience, a witty mask designed to blend mostly into the somber tone of the era without losing the vibrancy of their illustrious lifestyles. Imagine, if you will, the tinkle of a grand piano's keys resonating in a vast drawing room underlined by the soft rustle of silk gowns swishing across a marble floor. Just beyond the heavy draped curtains, a garden whispered secrets in the moonlight, while inside, the glint of crystal champagne flutes told tales of bubbly spirits amidst bleak times. Now, hosting a party during the Depression was akin to tightrope walking in a velvet blindfold while trying not to spill the caviar. The secret to success lay in the art of subtlety. After all, flaunting opulence was so last decade. The affluent did indeed host soirees, but with a twist of ingenuity, hence emerged an elegant practice of the come-as-you-are party. Designed to downplay extravagance, guests were invited in whatever attire they fancied, a rather strategic play on spontaneity, though personally, one would hope Mr. Van der Wall Street might have changed from his morning striped pajamas. These gatherings were orchestrated with a nuanced touch of what one could call humble grandeur. The host might casually weave amongst the guests, dropping hints about how the heirloom silverware came into the family recently, not through recent purchases, but through ancient, conveniently forgotten family ties that surely dated back to the Medici. Oddly enough, during this era, a new form of one-upmanship sprouted. Philanthropic contributions whispered over hors d'oeuvres made more for Michelin stars than Hard Times cookbooks. Talk of generous donations and charitable gestures were not quiet acts of nobility alone, but emerged as divine threads weaving their way through social repartee. It was not uncommon to hear Lady Abernathy discussing last week's bustling church bake sale with a touch of grandeur, as though her lemon meringue pie had single-handedly rescued the economy. Yet the wealthy lived not merely in monetary splendor, they reveled in realms inaccessible to the average mogul, or those who had to retire their early afternoon golf matches for more pressing economizing strategies. They found solace in peculiar amusements, such as constructing entire miniature palaces within the confines of lofty estates. These dollhouses, composed of Lilliputian enameled bathtubs and chandeliers crafted from petite gems, struck a delightful chord of warm whimsy. The only guests residing in these micro-abodes were potential insomnia cures, snugly contained within layers of miniature quilts. Life was a delicate balance of maintaining appearances without flaunting it like a Liberace concert. It came down to purchasing art, ever so distinctly focusing on starving artists, an exquisite blend of altruism and art acquisition, or perhaps conducting fox hunts with mechanical foxes, not for a distaste of decay, but to assure the public's ever-watchful eyes that their fox-loving hearts remained morally intact, and evenings, ever-magical affairs would draw curtains on a quiet day of intricate yet joyfully inconspicuous extravagance. Such was the nightly wind-down, a regal procession to plush, silent libraries bathed in the glow of golden sconces. Here, wealthy patrons would often immerse themselves in the comfort of classic novels or, perhaps humorously, further entertain themselves by attempting to decipher the financial sections of 6 newspapers in languages they neither spoke nor read. As the soft chimes of the grandfather clock inched toward a new day, the dear denizens of affluence, satiny robes swaying faintly in the evening breeze, started penning quick notes to esteemed associates across the ocean, partly because it was a gesture of polite society, and partly because the prospect of staying up past societal propriety exhausted even the most fabulously rested among them. Thus the hours drifted into those of a forthcoming sun, leaving whispers of empire, modest marvels, and secretive splendors to guide us into the next soft note of history's endless lullaby. In the heart of Manhattan, where the beleaguered streets below whispered tales of breadlines and hardship, a curious sort of activity buzzed through the plush sanctuaries of the ultra-wealthy. Inside these illustrious residences, it was as though the Great Depression was merely a misunderstood telegram that somehow got lost in delivery. Welcome, my dreamy listener, to the privileged world behind those ornate doors, a place where creativity and eccentricity often took refuge, allowing the wealthy to live normal lives, though their version of normal might seem anything but. These illustrious estates housed inhabitants who were not only adept at ignoring reality, but also at reinventing it. Take, for instance, the curious case of Lord Percival Popinjay, an aristocrat with an unfortunate penchant for wearing afternoon tea hats at breakfast. When the stock market took its infamous tumble, rumors swirled that Percival nonchalantly declared, "I never saw the point in numbers unless they were on banknotes, and even those can be outwitted with enough charm and a tuppence worth of ostrich feathers." While ordinary folk scrambled to make sense of dwindling paychecks, the wealthiest fashioned their own peculiar interpretations of thrift. Elaborate parties became impromptu art installations when Percy invited the crème de la crème of the city to a dine-on-a-dime evening. Each guest was tasked with creating a dish using ingredients that could be purchased for no more than 10 cents. A veritable challenge, unless of course you owned a personal vineyard in your backyard and chickens that laid golden eggs. Over in the far reaches of Boston, heiress Miss Arabella Butterfield found her calling in the culinary arts, convinced that the Depression was an ideal opportunity to sharpen her skills in gourmet cooking. An impressive thought, except for the minor detail that Arabella's concept of a simple, Depression-era stew included truffle shavings sprinkled atop caviar. Her high society friends gathered in their best finery to sample these creations, all while pondering what exactly was in that peculiar dish with the penchant for glowing in the dark. Little did they know, Arabella had simply discovered the usefulness of radium-infused condiments. Of course, fashion could not be overlooked. In a time where practicality overruled opulence for most, the affluent embraced resilience through sartorial ingenuity. Enter Alicia van Schnitzel, an eccentric heiress known for her sartorial bravado. She hosted a grand parade of recycled couture fashion where guests arrived dressed in outfits crafted entirely from repurposed linens, curtains, and, occasionally, bath mats. Each flounce and frill was a testament to a descent into delightful madness as audience members clapped along in ecstatic approval, of these ever so slightly absurd homemade creations. Let's not forget about the equally fascinating soirees conducted by collectors of peculiar antiquities, those lavish few scheming to keep art world economies afloat by inventing the concept of eccentric passion purchases. You see, the acquisitive elite often saved faceless sculptures or abstract paintings from potential abandon by investing in them, propelled more by a spontaneous yen for novelty than pure artistic appreciation. This was fine by the artists, who made ends meet by seamlessly combining their visionary creativity with the 100-button jot whistle's outer case, an instrument no one truly knew how to play, but possessed a sought-after gleam that captured the hearts of its investors. As the days waned, this petal-soft world of wealth, though punctuated by bouts of tinkling laughter and outlandish whimsy, was not entirely impervious to the outside murmurs of a world in crisis. Yet, within these storied walls, life played on, orchestrated in dulcet tones by those who wielded both fortune and fancy with a deft and buoyant assurity. All this might sound remarkably exhausting, but dear listener, these lavish stages of opulence and subjectivity nonetheless offered a curious sort of levity, a reminder that escapism is a necessity, sometimes crafted from the very threads of imagination. With this gentle symphony of extravagance still serenading our thoughts, we find ourselves caught in a different tempo, not unlike the drifting notes of a lullaby, carrying you to the brink of enlightening dreams. Curl closer now, as we drift softly along the silken threads that await in further whispers of history. Picture, if you will, a well-appointed room filled with soft candlelight, casting gentle shadows across a selection of polished mahogany and velvet settees. This is not a scene from a royal palace or a Hollywood movie set. This is simply an evening at one of the ultra-wealthy homes during the Great Depression, a period famously marked by economic hardship for many, but not, it seems, for all. While most folks were familiarizing themselves with the art of reusing teabags, the ultra-rich were learning, sometimes with bemused patience, the equally intricate skill of stock market speculation, though their failing brokers might have told you they hardly needed additional practice. Imagine them, pens poised wistfully over parchment as they ink checks, to recover losses, make investments, or maybe adopt another Great Dane with a taste for Art Nouveau furniture. Ah, the little challenges of life, right? The Great Depression for the fortunate ones felt less like being pinched by economics and more like an experimental play, featuring themes of excess and whimsy. One notable character in this real-life drama was Marjorie Merriweather Post, an heiress whose idea of frugality meant only buying the finest meats from 3 separate countries for her next garden party. After all, a good party isn't judged by its company, but by whether the hors d'oeuvres could double as cornerstone agreements for international treaties. The dining habits were just as lavish. Imagine a table spread groaning, not because of starvation's weight, but from the abundance of dishes carefully prepared by chefs who had perfected the art of gastronomical enlightenment. A simple breakfast might consist of caviar-topped eggs, a bracing cup of authentic Colombian coffee, none of that faux blend nonsense. And for dessert, yes, dessert at breakfast, perhaps a slice of cake, liberated from a 12-tier masterpiece. Where most folks were considering which end of the bread loaf made for the best sandwich, the wealthy were contemplating which shade of gold their next cutlery set should embody. But it wasn't just about food, as luxurious as it was. To escape the monotony of wealth maintaining itself, they'd attend or even host performances by celebrated musicians of the time. Jazz sessions would see the likes of Duke Ellington swing through the night, creating musical masterpieces, which were then humorously discussed over brunch the next day as less of a song, more of an experience, darling. Their estates were not mere living spaces. They were essentially private universes, complete with imported Italian marble, swimming pools grand enough for synchronized swimming teams, and libraries that offered more books than the average small-town library, though no guarantee that these books had ever been opened. After all, who needed to read about a world in crisis when the cherry orchards had just come into bloom again outside your window? The ultra-wealthy also found comfort in escaping geographical borders, not bound by mere national, Economies, they traveled abroad to encounter similarly entertained circles of influence. Their idea of a crisis was perhaps losing luggage containing their favorite patent leather dancing shoes in a country where the baguettes were larger than anyone expected. As we lean back to close this chapter of opulence and diversion, it's easy to see how the Great Depression, factual and globally keen as it was, could seem subdued in the world of velvet-lined daydreams and indulgence. Remember, even though everyone shared the same sun, filtered through various shades of skepticism and wit, for some, it was shaded by awnings of embroidered silk. And so, as the stars cast their indulgent twinkle over the wealthy wayfarers of the time, in the dreamy continuum of our tale, we float gently to another tale of navigating the peculiarities of a world that insists on being constantly interesting, no matter whom it troubles or delights next. Amid the tapestry of the Great Depression, where cobwebs and piggy banks kept each other company, there existed an intriguing nook of wealth and whimsy. Indeed, while the average citizen was poring over meager meals, the ultra-wealthy tucked themselves into a world as lush as a feather-stuffed duvet. Ah, consider, dear dreamer, the party invitations gilded with gold leaf, no mere paper. While others were rationing their melodies of hope, these gilded invitations opened up ballrooms echoing with laughter that rivaled even the most effervescent champagne flute. The crème de la crème were committed to outdazzling one another, an endeavor more frantic than a grandmother's quest for matching socks. Yet the trickiest feat was maintaining appearances, because, my dear sleepyhead, it's not enough to have riches. They must be conspicuously delightful. These magnates were akin to peacocks with pockets, strutting their wealth in a vibrant display, each feather perhaps as costly as a small village. Imagine the delight of attending a soiree where the roast was more theatrical than the drama it accompanied. It was as if the matron of the household believed Shakespearean soliloquies to be best delivered by well-seasoned beef. And let us not forget, while the bread lines formed a snake-like waltz down city streets, the affluent found solace in emporiums of decadence. Manhattan was the epicenter, a curious stage set where fortunes were flaunted over tables spread with imported delicacies. There, whispered tales persisted of an exclusive store where goods were delicately wrapped, not merely in tissue, but in the lingering fragrance of snobbery, a scent as elusive and intoxicating as an aromatic ghost. We must turn our attention to the fashion, an art form that to the wealthy was more statement than necessity. These were no run-of-the-mill garments, but wearable masterpieces. Gowns swept floors in tailored symphonies of silk, and suits were cut sharper than a sneeze in a library. And the footwear? Why? It was rumored that a certain heiress spared no expense even for her pet's booties, ensuring that her poodle's paw prints were as opulent as her own. Their automobiles were mechanical marvels, sleek ships that cut through the air, whispering tales of unbridled luxury. Consider the spectacle of a fleet of these rolling titans parked like steel sentinels, each polished so finely that the stars seem to take their cue from them. Let us not overlook holiday retreats. For the prosperous, every change of season warranted a change of scenery. Ski chalets, villa getaways, sailing private seas, they collected vacation vistas, as one might postcards. Each use an expertly orchestrated escape from the surfaced fray of fiscal woe. As we amble through these charming vignettes, let us pause to appreciate a dinner party gossip, one replete with twinkling eyes and tantalizing morsels of intrigue. Amidst the grand banquet spreads, guests exchanged whispers sharper than the cheese served, enacting a delicate dance of subterfuge and wit. And so, in the hushed tones of night, as you drift into slumber's embrace, ponder these vignettes of affluent lifestyles during a time of turmoil, a haunting symphony of excess that glided serenely above the roiling waters of economic uncertainty. As you become drowsy, your curiosity nudges onwards on its cozy path, eager for the continued unraveling of luxury, intrigue, and opulence that awaits beyond this gentle chapter. While the world in the 1930s was swirling with the chaos of breadlines and jitterbugging on empty wallets, the ultra-wealthy were huddled in their own peculiar version of survival mode, marked by quirky extravagance. Imagine, if you will, a parallel universe where wealth was as determined to be flaunted as the everyday necessity of wearing socks, a luxury unto its own in those times. As our story turns, we find ourselves peeking into the sumptuous life of the Warrington Bliss family, an emblem of high society who own their very own hilltop haven, dubbed Cheddar Crest, not because of the cheese, though there was plenty of that, but for the view as rich as a full-bodied wheel of the finest brie. Their family crest, displayed everywhere from the embroidered handkerchiefs to the bespoke drapes, bore the motto Luxuria intra formis, loosely translated to luxury in every awkward shape. The family took this mantra seriously, evident in their collection of eccentricities, a silver-plated pogo stick explicitly used for hedgehog races, a sport you probably didn't know you needed to hear about until now. Tea time at Cheddar Crest was an elaborate affair, as if the Great Depression necessitated afternoon escapades into absurdity. Here, rations were wisely replaced by scones the size of small planets, where sugar cubes were carved into miniature busts of notorious inventors. Thomas Edison with a particularly sweet tooth, one might add. Conversations consisted of philosophical debates about which sock should go on. The left foot, naturally the one with the decorative emerald trim, unsuitable for any right foot frivolity. The Warrington Bliss family's pet parrot, Aristotle, distinguished himself with an impressive vocabulary, specializing in profound questions on toast toppings, clearly out-talking the butlers, who had long resigned to serving both parrot and person alike, with much aplomb and excessive butter. In a bizarre twist of irony befitting the decade, the family established their own pretend stock exchange bubble with abstract items, feathers, stones, and the occasional lost monocle, exchanged with the kind of fervor that mirrored Wall Street's own less whimsical negotiations. These mock trades occurred in feverish delight at dinner parties, where guests sipped cocktails with skewered grapes and gin, an invention that seemed perfect for the year 1934, a year otherwise marinating in austerity. In their world of elaborate nothingness, Sundays were for sailing. In their indoor, sail pool, the ship, a cumbersome vessel of childhood dreams, drifted lazily over the chlorinated waters, its nonchalant air matched only by the resonant snores from Admiral Puffington, the house's charismatic cat, napping among silk-tasseled cushions in the vessel's crow's nest. Amid these adventures, reality mingled with this exclusive sphere like crustless sandwiches on a delicate china platter. When word reached the Warrington Blisses that the common folks valued thrift over splurge, it triggered a bout of inspiration. Thus began their quest to invent what they termed economically engaging entertainment, a concept that delivered serenades by moonlight, featuring harmonica-strumming maidens upon toothpick rafts floating atop the backyard fountain. The ultra-wealthy weren't immune to the peculiar sport of lavish gossip either, each whispered statement a currency of its own. Mrs. Warrington Bliss, with her ever-expanding collection of peacock feather hats, secretly fancied herself the unofficial queen of this verbal ritual. Down the grapevine of crest-embossed telegrams, tales of a particularly rogue garden gnome's adventure in the neighbor's flower bed transformed into a full-fledged saga of espionage and topiary envy. And so, with each tick of the gilded mantel clock, the Warrington Bliss family's antics filled another chapter of a unique history, one absent from typical history books, replaced instead by stories kept alive by wind-drifted laughter and gentle whispers through corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed always to twinkle in amusement. As the moonlight bathed Cheddar Crest in soft, silvery hues, our glimpse into this eccentric life softly draws to a close, inviting dreams encoded with dances upon feathers and the quiet echoes of senseless trades, a nod to the richer tapestry we continue to spin. Nestled within the winding corridors of societal law lies a golden inquiry. How did the ultra-wealthy manage to maintain their opulent lifestyles during the Great Depression? Fortunately, in this hushed chapter of history, the answer floats past us like the scent of old mahogany polished to a quiet sheen. The Great Depression was a time when the average person was tying loose ends tighter than corsets at a Victorian ball. Bread lines grew longer, yet, intriguingly, the yachts, oh, those glorious floating mansions, remained unscathed, gliding across the water like liquid mirages, refusing to vanish. Among these vessels of vanity was the yachting set of Wall Street wolves and socialites whose social calendars remained ticking louder than Big Ben on a sedate London evening. At the heart of this affair were the actors in our tale, industrious families like the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers who, undeterred by the financial shadows cast wide across Main Street, continued to dance the Charleston in their gilded drawing rooms. You see, the ultra-wealthy during the Great Depression weren't just surviving, they were thriving like the only green leaves in a sepia-toned world. Such opulence demanded a dexterous duality. On one hand, philanthropy served as a delicate facade, a velvet-gloved hand of generosity reaching through the curtain of hardship. Lavish galas were thrown not just as frivolous jaunts of indulgence, but curiously, as fundraising feats designed to boost social credit as much as fiscal capital. Enter the masquerade ball, because when life gives you lemons, make lemon-glazed caviar and eat it on fine china. One mustn't overlook the architectural wonders these wealthy souls inhabited, sprawling estates sprinkled along countryside roads like breadcrumbs to a proverbial treasure trove. With teams of tireless staff bustling about as though choreographed by the invisible hand of opulent domestic harmony, these mansions were worlds unto themselves. Imagine libraries the size of small municipal ones, resplendent with more first editions than you could shake a reading monocle at, offering a sanctuary of silence from the cacophony of external reality. Inside those princely domiciles, the sought-after chefs were experts in orchestrating sumptuous gastronomy. Figuring out what beluga caviar pairs best with is, after all, crucial research in the name of surviving financial calamity, is it not? In the dining rooms, tables stretched longer than an ambitious politician's promise list, laden with culinary masterpieces conceived as edible tributes to both taste and excess. Even amid the downturn, the theatre of wealth extended into everyday rituals. Children of these elite few were intellectually forged in fire, attending elite institutions where learning to sail was as important as algebra, a skill equally unneeded but profoundly useful in social circles. A well-educated offspring was less a progeny and more a living legacy, neatly embodimented in tweed and starched collars. Let us also wander momentarily into the realm of sartorial splendor. The ultra-wealthy, dressed in fineries that whispered the language of silk and satin, each garment a hand-sewn testament to continuation of status quo. Tailors remained employed, busily crafting masterpieces which covered not just the mortal form, but offered a soft shield against a world where the winds of change dared not ruffle cashmere. This reality, a curious juxtaposition of splendor amidst scarcity, beckoned policies and a political dance, stoked and stymied by the same flames. The very air felt charged with an electric blend of optimism, despite everything, underpinned by polite chuckles of those at private railway carriages, absconding to chateaux for weekends of intellectual debauchery. Yes, even the stock market's tumble provided the playlist for these exclusive gatherings, where stock tips were exchanged with the sincerity of social kisses, and cigars were lit with the bravado befitting a dynasty untouched by the dust of ordinary worries. Our luxurious yet ephemeral journey through this era gently comes to a close. The lives of the ultra-wealthy during the Great Depression, much like a well-spun bedtime tale, allowed the lucky few to navigate life's waters more serenely than the rest. And as we prepare to drift slowly to yet another corner of curiosity, one can imagine that privileged world, a place where reality folds away, wrapping the elite in cloud-like dreams and softly promising the continuity of comfort when so much else lay disrupted. And so, with the quiet fortitude of a history lesson well marinated in whimsy, we find ourselves stepping lightly onward to our next chapter, a gentle progression from the ethereal to the enchanting, like a whisper bidding goodnight as we meander through the twilight realms of history and tuck ourselves into yet another chapter. Let us drift gently to the gated mansions and oceanfront retreats of the ultra-wealthy during the Great Depression. Picture yourself draped in opulence, where dollars seemed more magical than mythical unicorns, and where, despite the dire cawing of poverty birds circling the skies, some could afford to convince themselves they were simply attending a garden party where the theme was economic catastrophe chic. The Great Depression, a time that for many meant tightening belts, patching shoes, and other frugal activities requiring more innovation than a wizard's cauldron. Yet for the gilded few, it was less about scrimping and more about creatively pretending to commiserate. Those were the days when a slight dip in the stock market meant putting off the third yacht purchase of the year. Such ghastly sacrifices indeed. Imagine our wealthy subject, a certain Lord Lyndon Plumptree McFeatherington. Yes, it's a name, not an entire English garden. Now Lyndon, not one to skimp on luxury even during economic droughts, faced the severe inconvenience of being unable to immediately import his favourite Scottish trout due to the Depression's pesky tariffs. Instead of despairing, he nobly settled for local caviar, a true act of aristocratic endurance. But the trials of the wealthy extended far beyond food. We must consider the truly dire reduction in champagne chandeliers. They had to settle for only 10 per ballroom instead of the usual 12. Pearls were scrutinized for just the right luminescent glow. After all, one wouldn't want to don dull oyster whispers. Daily routines within these opulent havens evolved into elaborate rituals that could only be described as performing depressive luxury. One might wake not to an alarm clock, how pedestrian, but to a live string quartet playing an uplifting Vivaldi. Because what truly said, "Rise and shine," better than a small orchestra right behind your headboard. And while the masses scrambled for jobs, these societal darlings invented new roles for themselves. House parties became the theatre for their dramatics, with themed soirees such as the Roaring Thirties or Prohibition. Pantomime, where guests would lament over the tiniest price hike of gold-leafed cocktails. One particularly wealthy widow, Lady Beatrice Swan Bovington, famously held a weekly event coined Gatsby Saturday, encouraging even more conservative economic roleplay by donning fur capes while discussing how terribly tiresome it was to choose between springing for Art Deco fountains or embellishing marble colonnades. The field of fashion, darling of the well-to-do, hardly faltered despite broader economic despair. Sartorial decisions offered their own brand of depression-defying perseverance. For instance, the era could flatten the hems of many, but for the wealthy elite, poofing required but a seamstress's wave. The wealthy's innovative thinking knew no boundaries. Their garden mazes began to mirror the convolutions of economic recovery plans. Why make do with one type of magnolia when you could engineer a hybrid that infuriated Mother Nature herself, but delighted the eyes of any discerning guest? Amidst phrasebooks filled with shibboleths of wealth preservation, diversify investments, retreat to the Riviera, host a small, intimate opera in the living room, was woven the true essence of the era for these few. Luxurious escapism. However, if you listened closely at their get-togethers, beneath the clinking glasses and theatrical sighs, you could hear an ever-so delicate whisper of genuine concern, often punctuated by questions like, "Darlings, how much should we tip the violinist playing Schubert during prospective foreclosures?" And thus, as we gently lay down this chapter in the grand tome of history, consider that within each glittering diamond necklace there might have been a single bead of sweat. The era's wealthy lived with as much flair as their ingenuity allowed, dancing through hardships with utmost panache, a dazzling footnote in the great dance of time. As the sounds of sumptuous parties fade into the slumber of memory, let us quietly prepare ourselves to wander onward into the next peaceful passages of history's delicate tales. As our journey through the enigmatic halls of high society during the Great Depression continues, let us step silently into the realm of the ultra-wealthy's dining rooms, those grand chambers where time itself seemed to take a pause, lingering over extravagant feasts and whispered scandals. Picture yourself in a room lit by flickering candelabras, their golden glow contrasting sharply with the chill shadows that dart about like mischievous spirits. The aroma of grand banquets wafts through the air, and despite the hard knocks of the era outside, within these opulent walls, laughter rolls like champagne glasses clinking in joyous abandon. In a world where shortages abounded, the dining table for the elite was a stage of opulence and culinary mastery. From richly flamed duck à l'orange to oysters served on ice sculpted into the shape of last summer's yacht, the elite ensured not a supper passed without the kind of extravagant indulgence that would make any sensible economist do a double-take. And there, perched at the head of the table, amidst Edwardian silverware and crystal goblets, was likely an host, now swathed in the satin finery of the roaring 20s, but still clinging to the jazz tunes and hearkening to the era of cloche hats and flappers. Dinner often came with entertainment that was meant to keep both boredom and social awareness at bay. A card trick here, a recitation of the latest poem there. The actors and musicians, whom the wealthy could easily patron, became part and parcel of the dining ritual, true artists of the sidelong glance and the whispered quip. One can almost hear the hushed crescendos of a string quartet nestled in some corner, half hidden by the slightly askew replica of a Renaissance statue. All the rage in tasteful interior design of the time. Even as the world outside wrestled with economic despair, the ultra-wealthy still held tightly to the elegance they could muster, sometimes rather dramatically. The tales this table could tell of Lady Beatrice accidentally toppling a bottle of 1918 vintage Bordeaux to distract from her misplaced informal seating card, a social faux pas that could have sent ripples through the gossip pages for weeks, were it not so deftly handled. Or who could forget the Duke's late-night philosophical debates on whether champagne really lost its sparkle faster when left open on a marble countertop as opposed to Italian terrazzo. Vital concerns indeed, but beyond the dishes and decor lay the intricate circumstances of human interaction that the elite so diligently choreographed. Each guest seemed meticulously selected for their ability to embroider conversation as deftly as the tablecloths themselves. Strategic alliances were as often forged here over comestible courses as they were in opulent office towers or at smoky gentlemen's clubs. The art of dinner talk was akin to a fencing match, parries and ripostes served up with an easy smile while fortune's great game was played out beneath polished veneers. History tells us that distinctive culinary trends emerged during this time, sometimes in delightful contradiction with the stark market realities. Hence, gelatin molds, those quivering sculptures of culinary whimsy, rose and sometimes sank as centerpieces. Here was encapsulated the aspiration to combine economy with extravagance, suspended within a gelatin frame, items both bizarre and beguiling, known affectionately by historians today as things that should not have been rehabilitated. The humble cauliflower, for example, found unexpected fame as the libertine substance that dared to be conquered by quivering aspic. And as our gaze drifts ever softly away from the infinite spectacle of another opulent dinner winding down, we imagine the guests, satiated, amused, and slightly tipsy, carrying their intrigues into whatever ballroom or boudoir awaited them next. These sumptuous repasts bridge the waning crescents of gilded pretense and quiet hope, perhaps the ultimate reassertion of privilege against the backdrop of economic turbulence. So as you nestle back into the comfort of your own pillows, allow yourself to drift towards the horizon, where a new chapter awaits in the story of how those who had so very much lived through times when many found themselves with so very little. Gently, ever so gently, we draw closer to the upcoming tableau, where the search for authenticity in such a grand facade continues. As the clock ticked softly in the corner of a richly panelled study, one might have expected to find some sort of profound contemplation occurring. This, however, was far from the reality for many of the ultra-wealthy during the Great Depression. For many of them, profound contemplation was reserved for deciding which tie best complemented their breakfast croissant. Indeed, it's hard to ponder the injustices of the world when one is preoccupied with the intricate nuances of balancing one's monocle while mastering the latest in dance crazes, the Lindy Hop. It is an amusing historical trope that the ultra-wealthy, let's affectionately dub them the Gilt Kings and Quinoa Queens, often lived in a bubble so insular that the economic cataclysms outside were but a distant thunderstorm masked by the ever-present buzz of cocktail parties. By day, their lives were a symphony of leisure pursuits. One could watch as they gracefully trailed a hunting party through well-manicured estates, or perhaps rather not so gracefully attempted a newfangled form of exercise called golf. The 1930s saw an interesting turn in how these affluent figures entertained themselves. Some discovered a new passion for racehorses, not so much for their speed, but for the social events that trailed the horses as persistently as a shadow. It was a sight to behold as they perched atop grandstands, equipped with binoculars so large that some onlookers speculated they might have been trying to catch a glimpse of the stock market instead of the racetrack. Art collecting remained a favored pastime, driven, no doubt, by the irresistible combination of social prestige and the hope that these pieces of art might appreciate more effectively than the timeshares in a New York speakeasy. These were not mere decorations. They were investments, conversation pieces, and occasionally makeshift dartboards when one couldn't quite fathom the abstractness of modernism. While the term country club might conjure images of leisurely afternoons and faintly somber tennis matches during the Great Depression, they often turned into exclusive enclaves where the cocktail dress was as important as the cocktail in hand. Fashion itself became an art and a battlefield, requiring careful navigation between remaining stylishly au courant while not, heaven forbid, appearing insensitively opulent. It was a subtle dance, accompanied by pearls clacking softly to the rhythm of whispered gossip. Travel, while limited for many during this era, continued unabated for the financially fortunate. Luxury liners, sailing from port to glittering port, remained bustling avenues of high society. Voyages across the Atlantic became long, splendid parties on water, with ship decks transformed into temporary ballrooms lit by the soft hum of strings and the subtle clinking of crystal glasses that bore witness to confessions both frivolous and profound. However, it wasn't all champagne and canapes. Slip beneath the gilded surface, and some of the ultra-rich were discreetly engaged in philanthropic pursuits, perhaps a not-so-furtive tug at their conscience strings. Whether genuinely fueled by altruism or the ultimate accessory for societal clout, relief efforts funded schools and orphanages, serving as a gentle reminder that even amidst frivolity and fortune, there remain those who work towards the restoration of the world's equilibrium. And so, in rooms filled with laughter, yet tinged with faint reminders of the world's woes, these ultra-wealthy found their days a tapestry spun with carefreeness and contemplation. The world outside might have been weathering its storm, but within these circles, life whirled on, dizzying and delightful, with each setting sun serving as a delicate bow tying off another day in their ethereal world. As the night once again drew its gentle curtain, let's leave these moments suspended in the velvet twilight of our minds, perhaps turning our gaze to wonder what other intricacies and peculiarities this era harbored, only to be discovered as dreams continue to weave their magic under the knowing glow of the moon. The year is 1932, and we're gliding effortlessly into the opulent chambers of those who managed to swan dive into stacks of cash rather than paper bags during the Great Depression. Picture yourself as a feather drifting through the lavish halls of estates that made Gatsby's West Egg Palace look like it came from a modest egg carton. Ah, the ultra-wealthy of the 1930s, a peculiar bunch who treated the era's economic woes as little more than an inconveniently dusty spot on their otherwise sparkling champagne flutes. Take, for instance, the meticulous art of breakfast chez Rockefellers. Here, mornings did not start with a simple cup of joe. Nay, their brews were probably concocted by a small orchestra, where the first violin played a soft, sonorous note to awaken gently rested souls. The coffee, ground from beans sourced from tropical locales you and I might only dream of, was sipped while overlooking personal gardens the size of Luxembourg, dotted with gardeners dressed more sharply than some town governors. Of course, these gardens were often accompanied by fountains so extravagant that even Neptune might blush. Rumor has it that some fountains housed exotic fish who dined strictly on imported breadcrumbs, a diet more selective than a cat with a silver spoon, and, quite possibly, satirical Epicureans of their time. As we drift through this narrative of opulence, let us not overlook the elegant soirée, a favorite pastime of those who embraced economic collapse as an opportunity for themed get-togethers. Yes, while the common folk passed their pockets for pennies, the roaring elite held costume balls where one could dress up as figures from the good old prosperous days. Nothing sparks conversation like bumping into a friend dressed as the embodiment of the stock market circa 1928, adorned with ticker-tape bows. Dinner, another social affair of resplendent spectacle, often saw courses more numerous than fingers you'd use to count them, unless you're a curious alien with extra digits. Fish courses followed by game courses, accented by wines hailing from the most unpronounceable of vineyards, gave way to desserts crafted with as much precision as an Art Deco facade. It's whispered that some hosts turned choosing the night's dessert into a game of whimsy. Picture a roulette table where instead of betting on numbers, guests placed wagers on whether the final confection would feature just a hint of lavender or enough gold leaf to rival Tutankhamun's headdress. A dance through the corridors of these grand estates wouldn't be complete without a nod to the avant-garde security measures that only slightly outlandish paranoia might inspire. You see, the ultra-wealthy didn't just lock doors. They installed alarm systems so complex they could rival the Manhattan Project, some presumably known to giggle upon any false alarm. They say a ruffled chicken borrowing into a hedge once triggered such a system, resulting in a midnight gathering fit for a quirky amateur sleuth novel. As we tiptoe through their lavish halls, we also peek into the libraries, where these privileged few stored leather-bound tomes as rich in prose as they were in gilt edges. Reading, after all, was a most revered practice, offering both prestige and a semblance of cerebral pursuit. The ultimate mark of intellect among this sterile-loined echelon was not just owning the complete works of Dickens, but boasting first editions signed personally to a forefather. This was, as you might guess, the height of literary one-upmanship. The juxtaposition was striking. Beyond the gates, bellies grumbled and hearts yearned. Within, even the bread was whisper-soft, though likely untouched in favor of some exotic toast. And so, as we gently close this chapter on wealth and whimsy, we float along in our reverie, moving ever so dreamily towards scenes yet unseen. The laughter of opulence and the quietude of then linger behind us, while in front, more tales beckon with their own warmth and wonder. In the hushed corridors of the 1930s, as the Great Depression cast its long shadow over the world, the ultra-wealthy carved out lives that were paradoxically both extravagant and oddly inventive. Imagine, if you will, a time when the monolithic mansions of the elite served not just as palatial homes, but as sanctuaries of peculiar amusement and eccentric pastimes. The glittering chandeliers in these grand homes witnessed more than just balls and galas. They saw the birth of some rather curious hobbies cultivated under their crystal gaze. Picture an oil tycoon, cozily ensconced in his library, leafing through volumes not of Dickens or Hemingway, but rather books on mushroom cultivation. Yes, my slumbering listener, among the leafy, verdant estates, fungi became quite the fashionable pursuit. Who knew spores could be so alluring? There was something delightfully odd about watching magnates hover over their mushroom terraces, puffing away on cigars while discussing the finer points of shiitake versus chanterelle. Meanwhile, in the kitchens of these grand estates, chefs performed culinary acrobatics that could put even the most trendy modern fusion restaurants to shame. It was a time of gastronomic whimsy, as traditional dishes were spun into culinary masterpieces with whatever ingredients were stashed away in the pantry. Imagine pheasant being flambéed, not with brandy as tradition might dictate, but with a spirited splash of bourbon, imported illicitly and enjoyed with an air of whispered secrecy. Gentle laughter and the soft clinking of glasses seeped through the towering walls of drawing rooms late into the night. Bridge was, of course, a staple pastime, but something more curious happened when bridge became blasé. Offbeat card games of their own invention took its place, games with rules so complex and bewildering they seemed to be created more as an elaborate charade than a test of strategy. They reveled in games like Duchess's Distraction, a puzzling ordeal where the main task was to distract your opponents with humorous and often outrageous impersonations of high society figures. The winner was not the one with the best hand, but rather the one most apt at dissolving their fellow players into fits of giggles. In a world where money was just slightly more plentiful than common sense, other quirky hobbies emerged. Miniature golf courses cropped up indoors, peppering lounges and parlors with their miniature rolling greens. It was not uncommon to find someone putting their way through a course that somehow managed to wind around grand pianos and duck under antique side tables, with caddies composed entirely of plush, toy camels for no discernible reason whatsoever. Artistry, too, found its way into the upper echelon's leisured activities, as the wealthiest painted, sculpted, and whittled to their heart's content. And here, dear listener, is where things took another curious turn. Imagine our affluent subject of interest lounging in a silk robe as they engage in landscape bobbin. This quaint pastime involved painting pastoral scenes starring bobbin lace creations instead of oil. When critics, and by critics I mean their own families, analyzed these masterpieces under faint candlelight, even the most bizarre combinations of farmyard scenes and lace usually received a bemused nod of approval. Then there were the fashion shows, not received in the typical grand halls of Paris, but right inside their libraries and smoking rooms. Fabrics might have been repurposed from curtains or reimagined tablecloths, with lines developed as whimsically as the diets of their poodle companions. These impromptu fashion parades were less about setting trends and more a celebration of resourcefulness amid the scarcity, a tongue-in-cheek nod to the unpredictable whims of style. As the flames of their lavish fireplaces danced, these are the memories the stones kept. Tales of treasure hunts through their expansive gardens, where clues were composed in boisterous rhymes, of impromptu plays acted in the attic, with clothes sewn from all around the home items, and of poetry, nights enriched with verses recited by heart or, more often, invented on the spot with joyous abandon. Our peek into these peculiar pastimes draws to a gentle close as we place these fleeting moments of imagined mirth and creative curiosity into the pockets of history. Even as the clock whispered its timeless tale, the innovation and frivolous flourish the ultra-wealthy embraced carved out a sliver of brightness in a world draped in economic twilight. But don't you drift too far away, dear listener. There's yet one more quaint adventure waiting through realms only the slumbering mind can fully explore. The Great Depression, a time when the world seemed to turn upside down, yet some of its wealthier inhabitants managed to keep a curious sense of uprightness. While most people shivered at the thought of an unpaid grocery bill, the ultra-wealthy were debating the intricacies of which fork to use for their chilled melon appetizer. It is said that even during the bleakest of times, some folks could light cigars with dollar bills, if one could find a dollar crisp enough for the task. Picture an elegant dining room, the size of a small city park, adorned with chandeliers that gleamed like oversized diamond tiaras. Our protagonist for this chapter, let's call him Sir Benjamin of Bountiful Bucks, was not merely content with banquets. He insisted on adding a sprinkle of extravagance even to his daily toast, which naturally had to be slathered with imported truffle butter. As he sipped from his crystal glass filled with water imported from some obscure French river, Sir Benjamin would muse about the trials of acquiring a proper vintage during such tumultuous times. The 1928 Bordeaux, after all, simply refused to age like it used to. But alas, let's not linger too long on Sir Benjamin's breakfast habits. Instead, let us wander into the realm of entertainment, where even recessions had their recess. For the ultra-wealthy, parties were not just gatherings, but grand productions that rivaled Broadway. Performances, minus the improvisational comedy of financial instability felt by the rest of the population. Hosting a party during the Great Depression was somewhat of a paradox, a lavish reminder that while the world tightened its belts, these folks left theirs casually undone. Imagine an evening where the troubles of the day faded beneath the melodies of a live jazz band, the likes of which could lull even the most ardent stockbroker into a smooth trance, forgetting for a moment the clamor of Wall Street. Not to mention the spectacle of synchronized swimmers performing in an indoor heated pool, because where else can one find such grace but above the dining hall? Yet, in the midst of such lavishness, there was a peculiar camaraderie that developed among this elite circle. The Depression might have been great in its reach, but it did not stand a chance against the sheer creativity of the privileged. Attempts at austerity were swapped for subtle displays of sly humor, like luxuriating in their very own poverty parties, where guests would don rags from Parisian boutiques and dine from gourmet soup kitchens, often featuring world-class chefs serving thinly veiled extravagance in porcelain soup bowls. When it came to leisure, the ultra-wealthy knew how to while away the hours. Instead of worrying over soup lines, they played at being captains of grand yachts, drifting along with the detachment that only a high net worth could secure. Ocean voyages became ever so slightly demure, voyages so significant that even Jules Verne would be slightly envious of the tales told upon return. Ski trips to the Alps were replaced with elaborate amusements at their own private slopes, where the only avalanche to fear was a misplaced pinch of caviar snow, falling down the wrong esophagus. In the evening hours, as their collective slumber approached, these paragons of prosperity would retreat to opulent boudoirs adorned with silks and satins, the luxurious nest to cradle their dreams. Feather beds, unlike any other, offered a restful sanctuary, washing away the day's peculiar burdens of wealth unspent. Their dreams? Oh, those floated seamlessly from the past to the future, laced with visions of a world where prosperity was not a singular pleasure, but a shared human condition. It was often whispered among the draped hallways, softly enough to drift between wakefulness and slumber, that perhaps such visions weren't as implausible as they seemed. And so, lulled by the gentle sigh of silk and cashmere, they succumbed to a slumber that crept softly into the night. As we leave Sir Benjamin and his contemporaries gently humming to the tunes of nocturnal rhapsodies, let us imagine them dreaming of new chapters yet unwritten, gliding elegantly through tomorrows filled with the wonders of both past and future. Smoothly, we find ourselves gently drifting towards that next story, eyes slowly brightening to the mysteries still unfolding beyond the horizon. Imagine, if you will, an evening during the Great Depression. It's not the dimly lit scene of breadlines and flapping newspaper jackets you might be familiar with. Instead, we find ourselves gliding through the lavish halls of a grandiose mansion. This particular estate belongs to Edith Bloomworth, a doyen of high society whose wealth during these challenging times seems to ripple like the sparkling waters of a seemingly endless champagne glass. Edith, with her flair for the dramatic, once quipped that the stock market crash and the subsequent depression felt like dressing up in last season's couture, perfectly dreadful. She navigated this dreadful world with an aplomb only someone propped up by generations of old money could muster. With her perfectly coiffed hair and penchant for pearls the size of walnuts, despite all that was happening around the globe, Edith seemed blissfully unaffected. But how did the ultra-wealthy really live during this time? Were they simply untouched by the world's turmoil, or did they have their own peculiar ways of enduring the era? Well, for starters, it wasn't all just extravagant soirees and opulent evenings. Edith's staff enjoyed a curious set of new instructions. With more time on their hands, Edith's footmen were tasked with learning to juggle, apparently to provide a distraction when stocks plummeted. She claimed it worked wonders for morale, though one wonders if the footmen agreed. While some folks chose to scale back on their daily lives, Edith had a rather inventive approach. She simply declared Tuesdays as "Don't Mention Depression Day." On such days, all clocks were wound to the year 1928. Jazz tunes crackled brighter on the gramophone, and Edith insisted everyone speak in the most jubilant tones. While it did little to actually change the course of history, it certainly made for amusing dinner conversations. Guests had to avoid mentioning anything remotely gloomy, under threat of having to perform an impromptu Charleston. Edith also decided fish were too melancholic a choice, given the name troubled waters used to describe the economy, so she replaced all seafood with exotic birds imported, not without some quiet grumbling, from distant lands. Parrots in sapphire hues paraded across silver platters, much to the astonishment of guests who often found themselves unsure whether to pet them or eat them. This peculiar culinary choice certainly set Edith's gatherings apart in the annals of culinary risk-taking. Our dear Edith was also something of a theatrical visionary. She took it upon herself to stage full-scale productions in her ballroom, with sets rivaling Broadway's finest, an extravagance meant to lift everyone's spirits. Once, in a misguided attempt at realism, a set piece depicting Wall Street's crash left an unfortunate dent in the Duke's carefully pomaded hair, to which Edith cheerily replied that the dent matched the times perfectly. Outside of the palatial gates, things were undeniably different, and Edith, perhaps sensing a shift in her social standings narrative, began to dabble with philanthropy. Thus, the Tea with a Twist tradition was born, a charity event where one could contribute to the less fortunate simply by correctly guessing the weight of a particularly corpulent teapot. The winner's prize was tea with Edith herself, while a portion of proceeds flowed toward efforts to lift local spirits and aid recovering families. But one mustn't think Edith's life was all whimsy and frolicsome disregard for reality. Even within her bubble, whispers of change drifted through the halls. The Great Depression, after all, had a way of puncturing even the most carefully inflated balloons. Edith, beneath her blustery affectations, knew the winds of change were unrelenting. As this chapter of Edith's story begins to draw its silken curtains, we leave her perched on the edge of her chaise longue, pondering the horizon with a mix of wistful nostalgia and calculated optimism. Her world, as exquisitely embellished as it was, couldn't escape history's inexorable advance. But for now, the music still played, the grand clocks ticked resolutely, and the world, at least within these walls, was a kaleidoscope of enduring elegance and exquisite absurdity. Now, drift gently, dear listener, to that place where dreams and history intertwine, as we pause our adventure until the morrow beckons once more. As we drift into this soothing conclusion, let's stroll down the less traveled gilded hallway of the Great Depression, where magnificent chandeliers glimmered with stubborn resistance above polished floors, and the conversations were more about pheasant than fables of financial hardship. Yes, indeed, for the ultra-wealthy, the Great Depression was less about breadlines and soup kitchens and more about questionable investments in abstract art and keeping up appearances while hobnobbing at Gatsby-esque soirees. The fever dream of opulence didn't halt with the stock market crash of 1929. No, dear listener, the grandees of society had become seasoned connoisseurs of finding ways to squeeze out joy amidst the throes of economic despair. Imagine, if you will, a Manhattan penthouse where the early morning light laughs its way through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a glow over a breakfast table laden with delicacies that only the upper crust could pronounce, let alone digest. The ultra-wealthy continued dining on imported caviar, convinced that the chill of austerity could be warded off by the gentle fizz of French champagne. Meanwhile, the finer fibers of society wove grand tapestries of social events, an endless stream of dinners, dances, and theatre evenings that swirled like silk and spun sugar. The ultra-rich took their societal obligations very seriously during these grim times. After all, someone had to buy out the front row at the Metropolitan Opera House and ensure that luxury automobiles still sputtered through the cobblestone streets of New York City, their engines purring like cats that had never known a day of hunger. In the privacy of their opulent estates, however, the narrative was a touch more subdued. Butler bells still chimed, and maidservants still flitted about dusting forgotten knickknacks. Yet there was a delicate recalibration in the air, a reflection of the larger world outside their walls. Charity became fashionable, and the ultra-rich donned altruism like an accessory, hosting charity galas with the assurance that one's generosity could be simultaneously displayed and laundered on the social billboards of high society. Indeed, few things polish the family name quite like a well-timed endowment in a grand ballroom adorned with velvet and good intentions. The museums and galleries were perhaps the secret sanctuaries of the super-rich, a place where, amid aisles of marble statues and priceless paintings, one could lose oneself in a time when Rubens and Rembrandt were vibrant certainties rather than merely pixels in the art market's erratic graph. Here, contemplation was encouraged, a pondering over deals made and those that might yet be seized from the swirling chaos outside. As their neighbors in less rarefied air reconsidered life's essentials, the wealthy sagely murmured over antique teacups, pondering the ultimate paradox, how to display frugality with flamboyance. Some remodeled their wardrobes from past seasons' extravagances, an act steadfastly referred to as vintage chic, while others appraised their art collections, gouging a profit from the nostalgia-laden brushstrokes of old masters. One cannot forget, though, that behind the golden facade lay bubbling anxieties. The ultra-wealthy of the Great Depression knew full well that the crash had played no favorites, and that their assets, while opulent, were merely digits at the mercy of fate's whimsy. Yet, with resilience as their silent currency, they bore the title of stewards of fortune, with both gravitas and aplomb. And so they shouldered their silk shawls and squared their Savile Row suits, aiming to reignite fortunes with the flick of a Monte Cristo cigar, illuminating their resolute profiles. As the skylarks of history finally calm themselves into the twilight, this shimmering reflection on extravagance and elusiveness gently descends upon a feathered pillow of reverie. Here, in the heart of a world who understood that luxury, like history, is cyclical and ephemeral all at once, we bid goodnight to the grandeurs of yesteryear's pages and softly encourage you to close your eyes. May your dreams be filled with all the mystery, humor, and humble grandeur that history has to offer, wrapped in a soothing whisper of yesteryear's elegance. Sleep well in the comforting knowledge that in stories such as these, luxury and levity ride hand in hand towards the dawn, painting shadows of jest and legacy beneath the moonlit tapestry of time.